Mildred Carter had spent her entire life walking through a world that too often tried to diminish her presence before she even spoke. A world that saw the color of her skin and the modesty of her clothes and drew unfair, shallow conclusions, never asking who she was or what story she carried behind her calm eyes and quiet strength. From her earliest days as a young girl in the segregated South, to the long nights of struggle as a single mother raising her son with dignity and prayerful persistence, Mildred had known the weight of judgment and the burden of being underestimated. Yet she never allowed that weight to bend her posture or sour her grace. She knew who she was. She knew who she was. And more than anything, she knew the power of raising a child not just to survive the world's coldness but to rise above it. That child, Elijah Carter, had once been a boy who couldn't afford brand-name sneakers, who stayed late after school to use the public library computers, who watched his mother iron clothes for neighbors and scrub church floors just to pay the light bill. He had grown up in a home rich in love, grounded in prayer, and fueled by resilience. That same boy had turned his pain into purpose, his limitations into motivation, and his dreams into strategy. Years later, through sleepless nights, rigorous discipline, and an unshakable belief in God's calling, Elijah had built something extraordinary, a revolutionary tech company, now shaking up the banking industry with cutting-edge innovation. And recently, he had been named its CEO, the youngest black CEO of a major fintech firm in the country, to honor the mother who had carried him through poverty, injustice, and every invisible battle that the world would never see. He gifted her a cashier's check, one that symbolized not just money, but legacy, gratitude, and generational restoration. Mildred received it with tears in her eyes and reverence in her soul, not because of its monetary value, but because it represented everything they had conquered together. And so on that seemingly ordinary Thursday morning, she walked into First Dominion Bank with a check bearing a significant sum, dressed simply as always, in a navy blue skirt and a soft cream blouse, her silver curls tucked beneath a lavender hat, her shoes polished but plain, her heart light with pride, and her spirit wrapped in humility. She had never been one to flaunt blessings. She carried them quietly, respectfully, as she entered the tall glass doors of the bank and stood patiently in the short line. She noticed how the security guard barely glanced her way, how the receptionist didn't greet her, and how the other customers looked past her as if she were invisible. But she was used to that. Her value was not dependent on anyone else's recognition. Finally, when it was her turn, she approached the teller window where a young woman named Amanda sat, chewing gum, scrolling something on her phone behind the desk. Her attention split between the customer before her and the text messages lighting up her screen. Amanda didn't lift her eyes fully when Mildred stepped up, simply asked with disinterest, "Next." Mildred stepped forward and offered a gentle smile. "Good morning," she said, handing over the cashier's check. Amanda took it, glanced at it, then at Mildred, and suddenly her casual demeanor shifted to suspicion. Her smile faded, her posture stiffened, and her brow furrowed slightly. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice dipped in doubt, not curiosity. Mildred met her gaze evenly. "My son gave it to me," she replied, her tone calm and warm, her voice as composed as ever. "He wanted to bless me. It's a gift." Amanda held the check up to the light as if its legitimacy could be determined by the way the sun shone through it. "It's a big amount," she said, half muttering. "You sure this is real?" The implication was loud, even though it wasn't. Directly said, Mildred had been here before, in different forms, different places, different versions of the same scene. Suspicion, dismissal, the automatic assumption that people like her couldn't possibly be the recipients of abundance. Amanda's eyes narrowed. "I'm going to have to call someone." "This check looks off," Mildred nodded, unshaken. "That's fine." Amanda stood, left the window, whispered something to a colleague, then returned, clearly convinced she was about to uncover something fraudulent. "You know, we don't just cash anything that walks through the door," Amanda added, her voice sharpening. "We're trained to spot scams. People try to play us every day." Mildred remained composed. "I understand. Please do what you need to." Amanda returned to her desk, stared at the check a moment longer, and without asking another question, without verifying anything properly, without making a phone call or even using the bank's internal system, she tore the check in half. Right down the center. The sound was violent, jarring. It sliced through the air like an insult hurled across generations. Mildred blinked, shocked not by the action itself. She had seen worse, but by the casual cruelty in Amanda's face, the confidence she had in her assumption, the arrogance it took to destroy what she hadn't even tried to understand. "That's voided," Amanda said flatly, tossing the torn pieces into the shredder bin. "If your son really gave it to you, he can reissue a new one. But next time bring something that looks legitimate." There it was, the full weight of disregard, the embedded racism, the systemic rot, dressed in customer service uniforms. Mildred stood silently for a moment, not because she was unsure of what to say, but because she was choosing not to let anger speak on her behalf. She gathered her breath like a queen steadying her crown, then calmly said, "Young lady, that check was real, and you just made a mistake you can't take back." Amanda raised an eyebrow, as if annoyed to be corrected. "Look, I'm not here to play games, she started, but Mildred held up a hand, gently. I'm not playing dear, I'm telling you the truth. And the truth always shows up, even when people try to bury it. Around them a few customers had begun to take notice, sensing the tension in the air, the quiet charge that something deeper than a bank transaction had just taken place. Mildred took out her phone. Her hands didn't tremble, her voice didn't shake. She dialed her son's number and spoke just 3 soft words. It's happened again. On the other end, Elijah didn't need clarification. He had heard that tone before, the tone of strength holding back pain, the voice of his mother enduring yet another moment of indignity. Give me the branch name, he said. She told him, I'll handle it. Elijah replied, his voice low and full of steel. She smiled faintly, said thank you, and ended the call. Amanda scoffed again, rolling her eyes. You're calling your son. What's he going to do? Come storm the bank? But Mildred didn't respond. She stepped back, stood near a pillar, and waited not for revenge, but for truth to reveal itself as it always did. As the moments passed, the bank continued its rhythm, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, footsteps echoing, but something had shifted, and soon everyone in that room would witness it. Mildred Carter stood beneath the tall, sterile ceilings of First Dominion Bank with the grace of a woman who had weathered decades of storms without ever letting a drop sink her spirit. Her presence now a stillness that spoke louder than the voices murmuring around her, louder than the sound of keyboard taps and muted conversations between tellers and customers, louder than even the memory of the ripping paper that had just symbolically declared her unworthy in the eyes of someone too blind to see her worth. But Mildred, ever patient, did not erupt, did not retaliate, did not raise her voice or ask for pity, for she had learned long ago that the deepest strength doesn't scream, it endures, and in that quiet endurance lies the seed of unshakable power. Standing near the granite pillar, she felt the familiar ache of memory rise in her bones, those years of walking Elijah to school when he was small and asking God to stretch a few dollars into groceries, those nights of sitting alone, in candlelight when the power had been cut, whispering scripture into the darkness like armor, and those times she had pressed a kiss on her son's forehead before interviews, reminding him, you are not less than, you are made for more. Let them underestimate you, God will prove them wrong. And now, all those nights of lack, all those moments of unseen tears, had brought them here to a bank where her son had become a national name, and yet she still had to prove that she belonged. Amanda, the teller who had torn the check, leaned back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, perhaps still convinced she had caught another fraud, another attempted scam artist, unaware that her casual arrogance had just exposed the quiet rot of a system that taught its employees to doubt the dignity of people who looked like Mildred. She continued to scroll her screen, unaware of the quiet storm about to unfold, of how quickly the soil of injustice can give way when truth comes crashing through. Minutes passed, and though no one yet approached Mildred, the energy in the room had shifted. Some customers were whispering, others looked at her with growing curiosity. The floor manager stepped out briefly from the back office to scan the room and raised an eyebrow at the sight of a woman standing still, unbothered yet clearly waiting. Amanda shot her manager a quick glance and rolled her eyes again, as if to say, don't worry about her. But then the screens changed, all at once. The televisions mounted throughout the bank, previously looping silent ads about new checking accounts and mortgage rates, flickered into a single, unified campaign. The volume raised slightly. The crisp voice of a narrator cut through the hum of conversation. At First Dominion, it began, we believe in building the future through bold innovation and strong partnerships. The screen showed polished images of digital banking tools, smiling clients, and then him, Elijah Carter, proud, poised, powerful, wearing a deep navy suit, walking through a sleek glass-paneled office, speaking with purpose as he introduced the bank's new AI-powered financial security initiative. We're proud to work with First Dominion to protect your future and empower your potential, he said, his deep baritone voice calm and commanding. The video shifted to close-ups of him shaking hands with First Dominion executives, being interviewed on a major news network, and speaking at a national fintech conference. The narrator's voice returned, led by Elijah Carter, CEO of Carter Tech Solutions, our newest partner in financial innovation. The air went silent, dead silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every employee at the counters turned toward the screen. Amanda froze in her chair, eyes locked on the monitor, her mouth slightly open. Her fingers stopped scrolling, her chewing gum stuck between her teeth. She blinked, looked at the screen, looked back at Mildred, and slowly, the realization dawned. Same last name, same eyes, same posture, same quiet strength. It hit her like a train. She had just torn up a check written by a man whose name was now being broadcast from the very bank she worked for, the bank she thought she was protecting, the bank that had just named Elijah Carter its national partner. Her face turned pale. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly aware that every other teller was now looking at her. And the floor manager had stopped in his tracks, jaw tightening. A few customers murmured, wait, that's him, Elijah Carter. That's the CEO guy from TV. And one elderly man whispered to his wife, didn't that woman say her son gave her the check? You don't think I think that is her son, she replied softly. Amanda swallowed hard, her arrogance melting into embarrassment, then into fear. She turned toward Mildred, who stood calmly where she had been the entire time. Eyes lifted toward the screen, watching her son not as a bragging mother, not as someone seeking recognition, but as a woman who had always known who her child was before the world ever did. The manager rushed toward her, eyes wide. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked hesitantly. Mildred turned slowly to face him. "Yes, we are so sorry. I had no idea you were," she gently interrupted. "You had no idea I was what?" The question wasn't hostile, it was surgical. The manager's lips parted but no sound came out. "You had no idea I was wealthy," she continued. "No idea I was somebody's mother. No idea I belonged here." Amanda stood now, awkwardly approaching the edge of her desk, hands wringing nervously. I didn't know. I thought you assumed," Mildred said softly. "You saw a black woman with a large check and decided I couldn't possibly be telling the truth." Amanda's face flushed. She tried to speak again, but Mildred wasn't interested in apologies that were only motivated by embarrassment. She looked around the room, then back to the manager. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about how many people walk through these doors every day and get treated like they don't belong because someone behind the counter can't imagine they do." The manager nodded hurriedly, trying to regain control. "We'll fix this. We'll make it right. We'll file a formal report. I'll call corporate." Mildred smiled sadly. "Do what you feel is necessary. But remember, true change doesn't begin with policies, it begins with perception." Behind her, the video still played, showing Elijah standing at a podium, speaking on the importance of financial inclusion, equity, and restoring trust between communities and institutions. The irony was thick. Amanda sat back down, now silent. The woman who had moments earlier doubted Mildred's very identity was now confronted with the full truth of who she was, not just the mother of a CEO, but a woman of grace, strength, and dignity who had never needed a spotlight to prove her worth. Customers who had watched the entire scene began to whisper words of admiration. One woman approached Mildred quietly and said, "That was powerful, ma'am. You didn't have to say much. You just stood strong." Mildred nodded kindly, thanked her, and turned once more to the manager. "Please let Elijah know I was treated fairly from this moment on. That's all I ask." The manager stammered. Of course. Anything else we can do?" She paused, then added gently, "Train your people to see beyond their bias. That would be a good start." With that, she walked to the door with the same quiet dignity she had entered with, her steps light, her presence glowing not because of the screens, or the sudden recognition, or the shallow apologies, but because truth had once again revealed itself, and she had not needed to raise her voice for justice to speak on her behalf. And as she stepped into the sunlight, the faces inside the bank continued to watch the screen where her son Elijah Carter, the man she had prayed over, believed in, and sacrificed for, now stood as a symbol of everything they never saw coming. The sun outside First Dominion Bank cast long beams of late morning light across the pavement as Mildred Carter stepped out, her silhouette outlined in gold, yet behind her the atmosphere inside the bank branch remained thick with tension, and the unmistakable weight of collective reflection that had just begun to settle over every employee, every customer, every silent onlooker who had witnessed what should have been a routine transaction turn into a mirror, a moment, a moral checkpoint in real time. And though Mildred said little as she exited, the echo of her presence was deafening, because what had just happened was not just a confrontation between an elderly woman and a disrespectful teller. It was a confrontation between generations, between prejudice and truth, between assumptions and reality, and most of all, between surface impressions and the deeper, unseen stories that walk among us every day, unannounced and uncelebrated. Inside, Amanda still sat frozen at her station, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes unable to focus on the blinking light of the idle terminal before her. She was no longer thinking about transactions or balances or routine protocols. Her mind was spinning, unraveling, replaying the moment she had torn the check in half, the certainty with which she had done it, and now the crushing realization of how wrong she had been, how blind her judgment had been, how small her perception had been, and perhaps, for the first time in her adult life, she felt the full weight of what unconscious bias actually looked like. Not in a training video or a staff meeting, but in her own hands, her own voice, her own choice. The bank manager, Mr. Wills, meanwhile, had retreated to the back office, now on the phone with corporate, trying desperately to convey the urgency of what had just unfolded, not just the public embarrassment of shredding a check from the son of their most prominent tech partner, but the potential firestorm if the moment went public, if the media caught wind of the bank that humiliated a black woman only to find out she was the mother of the man whose face now filled their marketing campaigns. And it wasn't damage control he feared most, but the deeper question of how many other Mildreds had walked in and out of their branches without names, without media-worthy revelations to validate their worth. Meanwhile, the bank's screens continued looping the promotional video featuring Elijah Carter, his smile confident, his tone sincere, his mission clear, and with each loop, the discomfort in the room grew, not just because of what was said in the video, but because of who had been ignored before it aired. Back outside, Mildred stood quietly at the edge of the sidewalk, her phone in her hand, not calling anyone, not texting, just holding it gently, waiting, knowing her son would call, not because she asked him to fix it, but because he always responded to the unspoken moments that mattered. And then, as if on cue, the phone rang. She answered softly. "Mama," Elijah said, his voice carrying a tension wrapped in love. "I saw it. I figured you would," she replied, her tone even. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am. God kept me still." There was a pause. "They called me," Elijah continued. "The regional director." The apology was immediate, official, and loud. "Of course it was," she said with a quiet chuckle. "Now that they know whose check they tore." Another pause. "Do you want me to do something?" he asked. "Do you want them held accountable? Fired? A public statement?" Mildred looked up at the bank's towering windows, then down at her worn but polished shoes. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for the next woman who looks like me to be believed without needing her son's face on a billboard." Elijah didn't speak for a moment. He understood. As much as his title held power, as much as his face was now being used as a symbol of innovation and diversity, he knew the real power in his life came from the woman now standing alone on that sidewalk, his mother. His first example, the woman whose prayers had built the bridge, his success. "Walked on. I'll make sure that happens," he finally said. "Not just for you, for all of them." She nodded, knowing he would. Because Elijah didn't just build apps and platforms, he built systems, bridges, justice. As she ended the call, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. It was one of Elijah's assistants, sent to pick her up and take her wherever she wanted home, a lunch meeting, a spa, anywhere. But Mildred, ever modest, asked simply to be taken to the library downtown. "I want to sit somewhere quiet," she told the driver. "Somewhere where people still whisper when they walk, and the books don't care what you wear." Meanwhile, back at the bank, Amanda had been called into Mr. Will's office. She sat stiffly across from him, her heart pounding, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, her eyes blinking back the reality of consequences she knew were coming. "Amanda," Mr. Wills began, his voice firm but not cruel. "Do you understand the magnitude of what just happened?" She nodded. "Yes, sir." "Do you realize you destroyed a valid financial document without due process?" "Yes." "Do you know who that woman was?" "Now I do." "And do you understand what she represented?" Amanda looked up, eyes glossy. "She represented every person I've ever dismissed without meaning to," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Mr. Wills leaned back. "This isn't just about her son being a CEO. This is about you having the power to validate or invalidate someone's truth. And today, you made the wrong call." Amanda nodded again. "I'd like to apologize to her," she said, "if she let me." Mr. Wills sighed. "That's not for me to arrange, but I hope you carry this lesson further than this job." Outside the office, the staff were murmuring about what had happened. Some were indignant, she didn't mean anything by it. Others were reflective. How often do we just assume someone's lying? And a few were quiet, looking at their own habits, wondering if they, too, had torn something sacred without realizing it. That night, Elijah published a short open letter on his company's site. It read, in part, "My mother walked into a bank today with a check I gave her, not just as a gift, but as a symbol of every night she went without, so I could go further. She was dismissed because she didn't look the part. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call in favors. She stood in her truth, and the truth eventually stood up for her. This is not a call for vengeance. It's a reminder to look again, to see people fully before you judge them quickly. The next time someone walks through your doors, ask yourself, are you seeing the story or just your assumptions?" The letter went viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media lit up with praise, reflection, outrage, and admiration. But Mildred Carter, sitting in a quiet corner of the city library, didn't read any of its perspective. She sat near the large windows, a borrowed copy of a Maya Angelou book in her lap, her eyes closed, basking not in attention, but in the warm, gentle sunlight of peace that came from knowing she had done nothing wrong, said nothing harsh, demanded nothing loud, and yet changed everything just by standing in the full truth of who she was. And perhaps, she thought, as a breeze drifted through the open window, this moment wasn't about her being recognized as the mother of someone important. Perhaps it was about reminding the world that dignity, like truth, doesn't beg to be seen, it simply waits until the world catches up. In the days that followed the incident at First Dominion Bank, the story of Mildred Carter and the torn check reverberated far beyond the marble floors of that suburban branch, stretching across digital headlines, national media, boardroom conversations, and household dinner tables like a parable dressed in modern clothes, echoing the timeless truth that dignity denied will always find its way back to the surface with righteous weight and undeniable presence. Yet for Mildred herself, the sudden spotlight was not a triumph she sought, nor a validation she needed, because she had never asked the world to make her visible. She had always been visible to the only eyes that truly mattered, those of her Creator, her Son, and every soul she had ever uplifted with quiet compassion and unwavering faith. And so, while Elijah fielded interviews on morning shows, delivering eloquent sound bites about financial equity and systemic prejudice with the poise of a man who had long prepared for the stage of cultural leadership, Mildred remained grounded, anchoring herself not in the noise of applause but in the silence of gratitude, for she knew that fame could amplify a moment but only character could sustain a legacy. Still, the world's response was not small. Letters poured in from around the globe, from single mothers in Atlanta to retired teachers in Chicago, from corporate executives in London to young black girls in Detroit who saw in Mildred not just a victim of discrimination but a hero of resistance, not just a mother of a CEO but a matriarch of generational healing. The bank itself moved swiftly in the aftermath. They issued a public apology, implemented immediate equity training across all branches, launched a scholarship fund in Mildred's name to support underprivileged women pursuing careers in finance, and requested that Mildred join their National Advisory Board on Community Relations. An invitation she respectfully declined with a smile and a statement that said, "My job is to build people, not policies. Let others carry that torch now." Amanda, the teller whose actions sparked the fire, had requested a personal meeting with Mildred, not to justify, not to save her job, though she had been suspended pending further review, but to look in the eyes of the woman she had judged and apologize without defense. That meeting took place quietly in a private room at a local community center, away from cameras, away from social media, attended only by the two women and a witness from the bank. Amanda sat across from Mildred with trembling hands, eyes full of remorse, her practiced words crumbling beneath the weight of genuine regret. "I saw the check," Amanda said, her voice cracking, "and I saw you, but I didn't really see you. I assumed and I acted on that assumption without mercy. I'm so sorry." Mildred listened without interrupting, her hands folded gently on her lap, her eyes soft but discerning. When Amanda finished, Mildred leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Do you know what the real harm was?" she asked. Amanda shook her head slowly. "It wasn't the check," Mildred continued. "It wasn't even the embarrassment. It was the reminder that, even now, even after all the progress people claim we've made, a black woman can still be viewed as a threat or a liar simply for holding something valuable. That's what hurt." Amanda nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I'll carry that lesson for the rest of my life." Mildred offered a small nod. "Then make sure you carry it into every room you enter, especially the ones where no one is watching." And with that, she stood, offering Amanda not a hug, not absolution, but the gift of a second chance, laced with the responsibility of change. Outside that room, life carried on. Elijah continued leading his company with renewed purpose, using the incident not just as a headline but as a framework for reshaping hiring practices, tech development strategies, and corporate training modules to better reflect the human stories behind data and design. He also started a new initiative, the Carter Foundation for Dignity and Innovation, which paired underserved communities with access to digital literacy and entrepreneurial mentorship, naming it after the woman who taught him the true meaning of both values. When asked in an interview why he chose dignity as a pillar alongside innovation, Elijah replied, "Because what's the point of building the future if people like my mother aren't welcomed into it?" Mildred, on the other hand, returned to her rhythms of community life, baking pies for church gatherings, reading to children at the local library, organizing coat drives in winter, and visiting her late husband's grave every Saturday to update him, in soft whispers, on the incredible son they had raised together. She carried herself no differently after the fame than she did before it, not because she was unaffected, but because her soul had already been rich before her name became known. She believed deeply that true influence wasn't about platforms, but posture, how you stood when the world didn't expect you to, how you spoke when silence was easier, how you endured without letting bitterness take root. And as the weeks turned to months, her story became less of a trending topic and more of a quiet legend, a case study taught in diversity trainings, a sermon example in churches, a bedtime story told to young daughters with dreams bigger than stereotypes. One morning, as she walked past the same bank where it all began, now adorned with a large mural of diverse community members including a painted image of her, smiling gently with a check in her hand, she paused briefly, placed a hand on her heart, and whispered a prayer of thanks, not for revenge, not for vindication, but for the justice of visibility, the long overdue recognition that sometimes the most powerful protest is presence, that standing in your truth with grace can shake institutions more deeply than outrage ever could. And as she turned to leave, a young mother passing by stopped her, clutching the hand of her small daughter. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said shyly. "Are you Mrs. Carter?" Mildred turned, smiled. "I am." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for standing there that day, for not yelling, for showing my little girl what power looks like when it wears patience." Mildred bent down to meet the child's gaze. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Joy," the girl said, softly. "Well, Miss Joy," Mildred said, touching her hand, "you remember something. Your name is your destiny, so no matter who doubts you, walk in joy." Walk like you belong, because you do. And with that, she rose, nodded to the mother, and continued down the sidewalk, her figure growing smaller in the distance yet somehow larger in spirit than ever before. The mural behind her shimmered in the morning sun, no longer just paint on a wall, but a symbol of quiet courage, of unexpected justice, of a woman who walked into a bank carrying a check and left carrying a movement. And though the world may eventually forget the headlines, the hashtags, the debates, it would never forget the name Mildred Carter, not because her son was a CEO, but because she reminded us all that sometimes the most revolutionary thing a person can do is stand still, say nothing, and let the truth do the speaking.